Since the global economic crisis of 2008, many of the world's advanced economies continue to struggle to recover. In many of these countries, growth since the crisis has been much slower than it was in the years prior. Indeed, when we look closely, we see that the 04 to 07 growth average is higher than the 2010 to 2013 average in just about all the major advanced economies, and that in some countries this difference is very large. What's holding back recovery? To understand this, we need to understand what kind of economic crisis we're trying to recover from in the first place. When the economy is not doing well, it is usually either supply constrained or demand constrained. When the economy is supply constrained or overheated, this means that consumers have money and are ready and willing to buy goods and services, but suppliers are unable to provide enough goods and services to satisfy consumer demand. This can happen if employers are unable to hire the workers they need to expand production, and it can happen if there is a shortage of an important commodity, like oil. In either case, the result is rising inflation. Because suppliers cannot provide more goods and services for the same price, they raise prices until supply and demand are at equilibrium. If inflation is not rising, the economy is not supply constrained. During the supply crisis of the 1970s, inflation frequently went into double figures. Are we seeing that kind of inflation today? Not even close. What about demand? When the economy is demand constrained, this means that consumers do not have enough money to buy the goods and services required to support the economy's growth. This happens whenever consumers' incomes fail to keep up with economic growth. Consumption is fueled by wages and borrowing, and a threat to either of these things undermines consumption and constrains demand. The global economic crisis was kicked off by a credit crunch in the United States. Americans borrowed more than they could afford to repay, and when the housing bubble burst, many borrowers were forced to default on their loans, with global effects. Governments rescued the financial system with bailouts, but this put them in debt and forced them to reduce spending. So banks were loaning less and governments were providing fewer jobs and benefits. Neither of these things were good for consumption. But why were Americans borrowing so much money in the first place? The left blames the banks for being too quick to offer people loans they could not afford, while the right blames the borrowers for accepting those loans. The reality is that the state failed to adequately regulate the system, allowing lenders and borrowers to make mistakes. Why did the state fail? Because American economic growth has become increasingly dependent on borrowing. The debt load on the economy has ballooned since the mid-1980s. Why has the debt load grown so large? It turns out that when you adjust for inflation, U.S. wages have not really grown at all for about 40 years. As we said before, to grow the economy, consumers need to be able to buy additional goods. When wages aren't growing, consumers have to borrow more to make up for it. The government was reluctant to regulate the financial sector to prevent dangerous borrowing because it needed the borrowing to maintain growth. When the credit crisis came, there was no wage growth to cushion the blow, devastating consumption. The advanced economies are still unable to recover from that collapse because wages have weakened even further since the crisis. Governments can raise consumption either by increasing borrowing or by increasing wages. Over the last 30 years, we've tried borrowing and it hasn't gone well. There simply isn't enough wage income in the system to sustain that much debt. Unfortunately, governments haven't learned from this. They have prioritized quantitative easing, in which state central banks, like the Federal Reserve, buy government debt from financial institutions in exchange for cash. This puts lots of money into the hands of the banks. The government is hoping this will encourage the banks to once again begin offering cheap loans. The trouble is that even if this works in the short run, in the long run consumers need higher wages to support that borrowing. Without a wage increase, we're just setting ourselves up to repeat the crisis all over again. So what's the solution? The government needs you to get a raise, and there are a variety of ways it can do that. It can raise the minimum wage, it can expand union rights, increasing workers' bargaining power. It can increase government spending, creating high-paying public sector jobs, and it can cut taxes for the lower and middle classes. How does the government know when it has done enough? When the economy is no longer demand constrained, it will begin to show signs of being supply constrained, and that means inflation will rise. When inflation rises, that probably means that the government has done enough for consumers for the moment and needs to look for ways to help suppliers expand production. It's a balancing act. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to like and subscribe. We'll be doing these videos semi-regularly. Have a great day.